Well, welcome everybody to another edition of the Psych Monologues. And yes, it has been a while since I have been on. And some of it has been, my household was afflicted by the plague, otherwise known as COVID, that is irritatingly, has the irritating effects of putting a brake on everything. It really irritates me. I know that that's useless and futile because it's going to do what it's going to do, but still, it's still irritating. So I'm back. It's been 4 weeks. I realized when I was looking back over my notes, and my voice still has a little bit of a lower octave to it. I was joking around my grandsons this morning saying I could double as the voiceover for Darth Vader, but I won't get into that either. So it just makes my voice easier for podcasting or radio, which I'm not doing. So anyway, welcome to the Psych Monologues. It is a podcast that is looking at spending some time exploring the intersection of faith, psychology, and spiritual formation. And looking back, I think I need to clarify a little bit of what the role or relationship the Psych Monologues will have going forward in the formation of this new nonprofit called Stained Glass International, or SGI. And ultimately, I got to clarify two different things. One is, what is SGI anyway? I mean, what's its mission? And its mission is to equip, encourage, and empower the next generation of Christians to live authentically in their relationship with Jesus, with others, and with themselves. That's every bit as much a part of their relationship to everybody else, really, because we tend to have a way of splitting ourselves apart, and I want to talk a little bit about that tonight. So I think the overall mission of SGI is to develop what I call outposts for the heart and communities for the soul, and someplace safe for people that don't feel safe or accepted anywhere else to be able to gather together and share life together, and be able to talk about the things that they don't normally talk about. We're getting to a point in the semester, for me at least, because I teach, where there's some reflection on where we've come from and what's happened, particularly in some of the groups that I lead, what's happened in our groups. And I've had a lot of people mention the fact, and I think my effort in designing the groups that are part of my classes, and I have 2 classes that have that groups play an integral part to it. But my effort in designing those and how they're led and the people that are in them is providing this space for one's heart. And Brene Brown refers to courage, or ordinary courage, as speaking the fullness of your heart honestly with others. And so it becomes this outpost. And I have students that actually describe it that way. It's like they wait for the opportunity to get to the group because it's finally one place that they can drop their mask, be known as they are, have fun, but also talk about real stuff. And their souls are filled. Their souls are made feel more alive. And that's the communities for the soul. So, and oftentimes it feels like an outpost. Compared to the rest of the world that we interact with, we oftentimes look at it and say we really don't have someplace safe to go with people that are equally committed to being safe with one another. And that's a whole nother issue that perhaps I'll devote a podcast or two as well to talk about, just being, what does it mean to be a safe person? And that's a longer conversation. I don't want to necessarily belabor that fact, but that's an overall guiding principle for SGI and the groups that perhaps will grow out of that. But the Psych Monologues is kind of the clearinghouse, if you will, of ideas and thoughts and interactions even around this thing of what's my faith journey look like, and what does spiritual formation look like for me? I mean, what's the journey like? What's the landscape like? And then taking into account the psychology piece of it. We give lip service to psychology, but we really don't recognize what it is and what it isn't. And I think we have to take into account that, because psychology, a soul-based psychology, because psychology today is not soul-based. Ironically, the Greek word for soul is psyche, but current psychology today doesn't do much at all with the soul or the heart. It does everything with the brain and the body, but it doesn't do much of anything with the soul. So I want to include that in the vision of what we're trying to accomplish with Stained Glass International. And so when I talk about equipping, it's providing materials and providing grist for the mill, or thoughts and principles and encouragement for people to live life a little bit differently, not dramatically differently. Just a little bit would be fine, because even a little bit would change things considerably. And then encourage is really about speaking to one's heart. It's not just saying something flattering. And then finally, empowering and challenging this next generation of Christians that oftentimes get very jaded and very embittered by how churches have treated them. And whether that's just or unjust, it doesn't really matter. They have excluded themselves from the community. And so I want to try to begin to create and support a movement of people that want to live differently, interact differently, and be someplace where people want to go to grow in their relationship with Jesus, but also grow in their relationships with others, and find the kind of acceptance that we all desire within ourselves. And again, that's a lot of the topics that flow out of and into what we talk about, or what I talk about. So pull up a chair, get comfortable. Thanks so much for joining me for a short half an hour or 40 minutes of your time to consider a variety of topics that hopefully will be encouraging and maybe give you some food for thought to move into relationships a little bit differently. So get comfortable, relax, and let's focus on some of these things. Now, what I want to talk about, and this one has been percolating in the back of my mind for quite some time, actually. And some of it is because of how stunned I am at what I said just a minute ago, how disintegrated we are. And and the title of the podcast is Knowing, Being, and Doing. And what I want to do is play with those words a little bit in light of how we conduct ourselves, how we know about ourselves. What kind of being are we? I mean, we would say, well, I'm a human being. Okay. But is that really how we live is the question. I mean, what does it mean to be a being? And so I want to unpack some of that just briefly to maybe trigger some thoughts and ideas about this. And so the thing that I want to kind of insert into your attention right away is that the sequence of those three words have everything to do with how we engage one another and how we engage life. And ultimately, if I might add, because since that's what I keep saying over and over again, is how we engage ourselves, which we do. All you have to do is watch what we do when we make a mistake, and you can see right away what the engagement actually looks like. So knowing, being, and doing are the three main terms, and then we'll play with them on the backside. So let me start with knowing, since I'm in the world of knowing. Even when I was a counselor, that was the case. One of the interesting things about being a counselor and sitting and talking with people about things is that you begin to realize that sometimes I'm at cross purposes with the person I'm sitting down to talk to. because it seems like they're doing everything in their power to not know something, and I'm doing everything in my power for them to know something. And the overriding assumption is that knowing something will actually make it easier or better for them. And that's not necessarily true. There's a lot that we do to cordon off sections of our being, who we are, our what I would call the landscape of our hearts. We cordon off various areas and just condemn them. I mean, it's like we put a no trespassing sign on it and say, hazardous zone, whatever it is. And we never open that up or let other people see it because we're convinced that they will do to it what we are doing to it. And that is condemn it. So knowing actually is something that we can master. And in this world of information, I was just talking about this with my daughter last night, and that is we live in a glut of information, which makes it really hard. Because how do you sort out what is worth knowing and what isn't? And it may not be relevant. That's one way that we can use it. But we really sincerely believe that knowing something will make all the difference in the world. And all you have to do is pay attention to when somebody tells you something about what they're struggling with or what they might be feeling or thinking. We tend to have ready-made answers that tell them more, that give them more information, even know more information about what the Bible has to say about it. And the assumption is that will make a difference. It will make us better. It will equip us. And while knowing, let me stop for a second and say something in parentheses. We assume that each one of these things will make things better. And so more information will make it better. If you know more information, you will change. And that's not true. I mean, interesting study was done many, many years ago. I don't know how many. And what was interesting about it was about people who smoke, okay? And so the experiment went this way. They had three groups of people that they studied in giving them information from the side of a cigarette package. And what they found is that there were probably 80% of those people that simply disregarded what was on the side. They couldn't tell you what was on the side of a package of cigarettes. And then there's another 10% that take the information and actually change their behavior, actually do something with the information. And then there's another whole 10%, if you will, that change only when they're in relationship with somebody that walks with them through that change. Okay? So we assume that information always makes things better, always. And whether that's information that comes from the Bible or from ourselves or saying what we believe to be true to the person, whatever it is, that's how we treat ourselves because we believe that information solves everything. And while it might be interesting, it may not change anything. And I can be the most, and the reality is that in a lot of cases, you talk to people that are addicted to certain substances, they probably know more about it than you do. A lot more about it. But it's not enough to change because it meets other needs. And information, while is information, it doesn't change the constellation of needs we have. And it doesn't address those things. So we just assume that knowing something equips us. And it doesn't necessarily do that. Now, it's important. It's important. I need to know something in order to make some kind of decisions. But then you have also these people in the world around us, maybe yourself, that says, I just need a little bit more information because then I can make my decision. And the reality is that what the way we approach information is it will solve our problem of uncertainty. And we're sure that once I get certainty, I can make my decision then. But it's rarely the case. I mean, it's rarely the case because more information doesn't always change anything. I just know more about it, but it doesn't necessarily change anything. But that's the world that we live in. There's such a high value on knowledge, and we esteem and applaud people who know a lot of stuff. We call them experts, right? And we think, man, look at them. Look at all they know. And that's it. that's it. And it really, I mean, in a lot of ways, it depends on your metrics, if you want to put it kind of technically. Is like, on what measure are we going to use to say that knowing something actually makes any difference at all? Because I can know everything about nothing. I can know a little bit of everything about a lot of things, but it doesn't mean I know it, really. And so knowing oftentimes is a ruse. It's a curtain behind which we hide. And behind that curtain is still all the things about us that drive us along. It's not just the information. And so it's a double-edged sword in both regards. Knowing is good. It's good to know things. It's good to study things and be able to make informed decisions. But sometimes it can be, that sword can also cut us in the sense of I get paralyzed by trying to know something instead of making a decision and risking the outcome. And see, that's just it. We just think more information reduces the risk. And it doesn't always do that, really. So knowing is one thing. Excuse me. I still have this leftover cough. And then the second one is being, which is way more ambiguous and amorphous, and this is less emphasized in our way of thinking. We emphasize thinking over being. And one of the biggest questions that I confront is, how does one cultivate your being? Just being, okay? And it gets really pretty awkward when it comes right down to it, because just being requires some measure of acceptance. Like accepting me as I am, my being, how God has created me, how my experiences have influenced me, the things that I've learned along the way, the knowing part. But all of those things are a composite of my being. And my being is the thing that people interact with. But if you look at how we think about ourselves, or even how we judge the value of ourselves, we might call ourselves human beings, but if you watch us and watch how we live and how we relate, it would be far easier to conclude that we are human doings rather than beings. We don't think our being is valued enough, so we have to translate it into the third thing. And the third thing is doing. And doing is another interesting one, because it's another double-edged sword. Because I can be, backing up a second, I can so emphasize my being that I do absolutely nothing. Or I can get so self-consumed with my being. And a lot of times that's exactly why we emphasize doing, because we think that, validating my being is somehow selfish, and somehow I will become so self-consumed and self-absorbed that I won't care about anybody else. So we make an error in the opposite direction, and we negate everything about our being and turn it to just what I do, which is that third thing, this doing. It doesn't mean that doing things is bad. It doesn't mean that at all. Because when it's emphasized over everything else, then our emphasis, our function, our value is built solely, which is key here, which is built solely on accomplishment and achievement rather than who we are, the nature of who we are. Because being is something you cultivate, doing is something you do. And if we cultivate, if you will, an emphasis on doing things, then we are what we do. And the downside of this is it opens wide the door for shame. Because shame is all about whatever I do is an indictment of who I am. So if you criticize what I do, you are criticizing me and who I am, which is a terrible boundary problem, okay? Because my performance is not a judgment of what my person is. But we tend to not have any boundaries between those two things. And if I get criticism or feedback about my performance and I turn it into I am the worst human being on the face of the earth, then there really is no way that I can change the very thing that I've been striving to do by doing things, right? So the double-edged sword of doing things is, yes, doing should flow from something, but doing things only for a substitute for who I am, my being, is not enough. And we become an empty shell of doings. And we forget all about who we actually are, which is the being part, okay? So consider for a moment just the order of these things. Because you can shuffle these around in a variety of ways, right? You can go doing, knowing, and being, or you could do knowing and doing and being, or you could do being and knowing and doing. Now, not to get lost in the weeds here, I want to narrow it down to two of the sequences, okay? And the first one is knowing and doing versus being. Because oftentimes, if you look at it, our emphasis is on knowing and doing. And we assume that it will naturally impact our being. And while some of that is true, I mean, granted, you can behave yourself into certain ways of being, for sure. At the same time, we can get so lost in the knowing and doing that we forget entirely about the nature of who I am, my character, the contours and the elements of my heart that are actually informing the knowing and doing, but I am not paying attention to those things at all. And so knowing and doing oftentimes tempts us into creating an appearance of being that is not true to the thing that is behind it. And so, as oftentimes I do, I would point to the Wizard of Oz. Because the Wizard of Oz was unmasked by Toto, the smallest member of the cast. And what did he say? Don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain. I am the Wizard of Oz. Knowing and doing, his ability to know and do things in a particular way wowed people to such a degree that they paid no attention to the person who was generating all of that. And so, how do we live our lives? Do we live our lives with knowing and doing, which oftentimes in the spiritual sense, that is a lot of what we do, is that if I just know more stuff about God, about theology, about, anything else that can be found in the Bible, just knowing more of that will translate into doing things differently. And for a while, that's true. That's the tempting part of this. For a while, that's true. But sooner or later, our being leaks into that. And if the being part of us is shriveled and undeveloped, it will start showing up in the knowing and doing, and we will become so exhausted and fatigued and just burned out in the knowing and doing that we have no reserve, because the reality is our being is the reserve. It's the reservoir from which we do and know. Which brings me to the second one, being, knowing, and doing. Now, this is not magical, if you will. If I emphasize and cultivate the development of my heart, how will it impact what I know or how I know something? I think it has a lot to do with it, because the nature of our being, the ground zero of our being is our heart. At least that's what Scripture tells us. It's everything about us. It's not just that organ beating in the middle of your chest. It's not just our emotions. It is dreams and desires and passions and impacts that we've had, all combined into one place, and it drives us along. And so the being part then informs what I know, how I even organize the information I have, and how I see it. Through what lens do I see it? Everybody sees things through a lens. If somebody tells you they are unbiased, they're lying. They can't be. Because as humans, we will always create a world of values. Some things are more important than other things. Some things are seen in a particular way more so than other things. That shows up in our relationship with God too. Because before too long, we take all of the things that we have had, the experiences and other things, and we substitute those for how God has revealed himself. We think that what we know and the filter through which we see God is the truth about him. And time again, if you read through the Gospels and read through Jesus' interactions with people, what you will find is the people that were already broken in their images of God were very much attracted to Jesus. The people that thought they knew, there it is, knew God and that's how God was going to be, were very threatened in their being, because the knowledge that was being portrayed, embodied in Jesus, was threatening. And suddenly the foundations of who they are was being broken or being shaken. So my being creates a base in order for me to know in a particular way, and that knowing informs what I do. And it's a natural process. We don't trust the process, I might add. We really don't. That's why we short-circuit it and do knowing and doing first, and hope that the being comes along for the ride. But what it requires of us is a commitment to a wholehearted way of living, because that's what we're talking about here, being, knowing, and doing. Because when you think about it, for example, let me give you an example. The word obedience usually has some very negative connotations to people. However that's been used in their world, it's like an imposition on them. But the interesting thing about the word obedience, and this is just my own word nerdiness coming out, but the Latin phrase that is to obey actually means to listen. And to listen leads to doing something differently. And that's the emphasis. So when you read, for example, the Sermon on the Mount, you're not reading a list of objectives for you to accomplish. You're reading and watching unfold before your very eyes a way of understanding the contours of your own heart. It's not so much what you do that matters, although it's important, but it's not so much that, as what drives what you do, which is not only the knowing but being. And the example I give all the time is just a well. The water flows out of that well, and we look, oftentimes we're tempted because we depend on the water coming out of that well, but we're downstream. And there's all sorts of trash that begins to get in the way of our behaviors and our choices and our experiences and everything else. And we start doing everything we can to get the trash moved out of the way. But it never really occurs to us to go upstream and see what's contaminating the well. And that's what the Sermon on the Mount is all about. I mean, the title tells you where it happened. It doesn't tell you the content. Because the Sermon on the Mount is a sermon about the human heart. And if you open it up and look at it from that point of view, you begin to understand that Jesus is saying all these things. You have been told, and I tell you this. And it's like, it's about your heart, people. And once you get your heart under development, then your knowing and doing will change. But it's a slow, laborious, tedious, long process that we have no patience for. We would rather have a relationship with Jesus that is a microwave version of what is being offered us, which is a crockpot version, which means developing over time. But we want a fully formed, completed one right away. And we don't want to have to make bad decisions. We don't want to have to risk anything. We sure as heck don't want to have to trust anybody, including ourselves. But that is the very tools by which we construct our being and our heart. And so when I started out and I was talking about we desire SGI, we desire to create outposts for the heart. And that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about here, is we've got to be safe with ourselves, for one. Our chances of being safe for anybody else is pretty minimal if we can't figure out a way to be safe with ourselves. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean everything's fine, I'm okay, you're okay, let's just get on with life. No, it doesn't mean that at all. It means taking the time to develop and to lean into opportunities that we have to develop our being. Because that sets the stage for knowing the world around us and the people in it. And it also sets the stage for how we will do something. And that's the challenge of the day, right? The challenge of the day is the very nature of what we do to develop ourselves. And it doesn't just magically happen. We want to put it on autopilot. I want to put it on autopilot. I'd love for it to be that way. But we don't. The reality is that even the writer of Hebrews says, don't neglect getting together with other people that are trying to do the same thing. Because the writer of Hebrews obviously knew that we need each other in order to accomplish these things. We can't do it alone. And I'll end on this. There is an old African proverb that I once heard, and for those of you who don't know very much about my background, I've spent a lot of time working in the missions community and doing mental health things with the missions community. I still do. And I heard a friend talking about this who had been to Africa a lot. And she commented about the fact that there is an old African proverb. And it goes this way. It goes, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And I think there's a lot of truth to that very thing, that we don't develop in isolation. We don't develop in a vacuum. We were designed for community. We were designed for connection. That's why we're driven to have belonging. That sense of belonging is the very fabric, it's the very context in which we grow. Children grow in a context of grace and truth and acceptance and support and encouragement, and the list goes on. And nothing says that by the time I get to be an adult, I don't need that anymore. And our ability to accept ourselves oftentimes is supported and even encouraged by the acceptance of others. Because we speak the things that we are condemning ourselves for, and we don't find condemnation. And the challenge is if under those circumstances, somebody is lying. Because if I find support for the thing that I'm condemning myself over, then either I'm lying to myself that I am worthy of condemnation and that's the only way I'm going to change my behavior, or they might be right and they might actually be reflecting the heart of God to me that says growth starts with acceptance. You don't grow to be accepted. It starts with acceptance. And that's true in our development, and that is true in our continuing journey into a relationship with Jesus and with each other and with ourselves. Because we always have these three targets that we have to keep in mind. So which do you emphasize in your life? You go into work, you go into relationships tomorrow. Is it about knowing and doing, or is it about being and knowing and doing? And so when we cultivate and care for ourselves, we actually enhance and potentiate our ability to know what? Not only ourselves, but to know another person, which creates intimacy. And not only knowing another person, but also informing what I do relative to the other person, which is a whole nother topic that I want to set aside before the year is out to talk about, and that's encouragement. How do I encourage somebody? Well, I've got to have enough of a relationship to do that, because the heart of encouragement is the heart. So, something to think about for the evening. As always, I am very thankful for your sitting down and listening. Couple things just to remind you about, which I always do at the end, just to keep people kind of present. I never know who's new and who isn't that is listening in. But if you have questions, DM me on Instagram. I can be reached there, or you can hit the website at drmitch.com. And there are places for you to leave a comment or leave a question, and I gladly scoop those up and have those inform what I have to talk about on the podcast. But we've added a new feature to the website. It's not to be annoying, but we need to have people subscribe on the website to be notified of any new content that comes up. I've got a blog post I'm going to be posting here within the next week, and you'll know about it by being subscribed to the website. So when you hit the website and you get that little pop-up that says subscribe, please do that. You'll be informed of new blogs, new podcasts, any new content that's in there, so you can subscribe and follow on the website. Of course, you can also follow us on 3 different social media outlets. I'm not in all of them. I can't keep up with the 3 that I have. But Instagram at the Psych Monologues, we can be found there. At Facebook at ray.mitch, and LinkedIn, drmitch, M-I-T-S-C-H, if you don't know how to spell my last name. Everybody thinks they know, and then they drop the S and they wonder why they can't find anything. So as far as the podcast is concerned, we can be found on any of the platforms that you usually use to listen to podcasts. If you like what I'm talking about or have talked about, pass it on to somebody else. Invite them to come and listen as well. Maybe they can do that and pass it on to other people. I'm particularly interested in inviting this next generation into some kind of dialogue about the world of Christianity and walking with Jesus and being in relationships. So you can find us on Spotify or Stitcher or Podbean or Amazon Music or iHeartRadio, anything like that. And finally, if you're interested in partnering with us, thank you. We are most grateful. It takes a lot to get a nonprofit off the ground and to begin to develop some kind of infrastructure to do this. But if you're interested in partnering with us, you can do that. You can support the scholarship fund, or you can support the general spending that comes with keeping the quote unquote figuratively the lights on and the podcast running and paying for those sorts of things, and also being able to sponsor other silent retreats for students not only of CCU but also of other universities. Hopefully we can get the word out to other Christ followers and other universities that aren't coming to CCU and don't hear this stuff. So the scholarship fund is primarily set up for people just getting into their careers, and so they're alumni of CCU and obviously anyone else that wants to join in. So there is donation buttons throughout the website. At the very bottom of the page, on page 1, you'll see donate. It will take you to a payment page, and you can either choose to donate to the scholarship fund for the silent retreats or for the general mission of SGI, and do it that way. So now if you decide, as I had someone do, if you decide you want to give to both, which we would be ever so grateful for, then you have to do it separately. You have to do one, consummate, the transaction, and then come back and do it again. That's the only way that it works right now with PayPal. We don't have real sophisticated systems for stuff like that. So if you would rather write a physical check, you can certainly do that. Make the check out to Stained Glass International. The address is SGI or Stained Glass International, P.O. Box 160, East Lake, Colorado, 80614. Well, I think that's it for tonight. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it gave you some food for thought. Join me again in another week. And as always, love ya. Later. Bye.